First, they said he wasn't a legitimate leader. Then the US president indicted him on drug trafficking charges. Finally, they sent in the US military to capture him and bring him to face justice in a court in Miami. Now, if you're thinking, hold on, I thought Nicolas Maduro went to New York, not to Miami. That's because I'm not talking about him. I'm talking about the capture of Panama's dictator, Manuel Noriega, ordered by George H.W. Bush all the way back in 1989. Because what happened recently to Venezuela's leader might seem like another unprecedented move by an unpredictable US president. But zoom out and you can see that this all follows a 200-year pattern of US interference in Latin America, known as the Monroe Doctrine. Or, as this administration puts it,
the Donroe Doctrine.
Using special military forces, overthrowing governments, and then taking control of the resources, that's all part of the playbook.
This is, in a way, a return to a particular 19th century vision of how American power might be used.
In this FourSight, we're going to look at what exactly the Monroe Doctrine is, how US history has influenced Donald Trump's foreign policy, and why Venezuela might just be the beginning.
We thought the era of US military interventions in Latin America was over. It is not.
Nicolas Maduro's capture and then his indictment follows months of pressure on Venezuela as part of a so-called war on narco-terrorism. But since then, Trump's mostly been talking about something else.
Oil, oil, oil. We'll be selling large amounts of oil.
And the US administration is being pretty upfront about why they're really intervening.
The United States is using its military to secure our interests unapologetically in our hemisphere.
Now, this plan to secure America's interests in the region was actually all laid out in a document a couple of months ago. This, the National Security Strategy, and it was signed by none other than Donald Trump. It's a 33-page document that basically outlines MAGA's vision for America's place in the world. It talks about refocusing Washington's attention on the Western Hemisphere. Now, technically, it's everything west of this line here on the map, but historically, when US presidents talk about the Western Hemisphere, they're talking about these two continents, North America and South America. Now, the document says that it wants the Western Hemisphere to remain reasonably stable and well-governed enough to do three things. 1, prevent and discourage mass migration to the United States. 2, stop the flow of drugs and combat narco-terrorists. And then finally, to ensure, quote, America's continued access to key strategic locations in the region. And this document does something else. It makes clear that the Trump administration is inspired by an idea that is much, much older. That, quote, the United States will reassert and enforce something called the Monroe Doctrine. So let's look at what exactly the Monroe Doctrine is and how what's going on today has been influenced by something that happened more than 200 years ago. In December 1823, in a country not even 50 years old, President James Monroe delivered a speech to the US Congress. As nations across Latin America were gaining independence primarily from Spain, Monroe made it clear to European powers that the Americas were off limits to any more colonization. It was a speech seen as promoting sovereignty, self-determination, and democracy.
The Monroe Doctrine was originally a defensive posture, warning European colonial powers to stay out of the hemisphere, and so it was welcomed by many Latin American leaders.
But the Monroe Doctrine also carried a clear warning that if anyone in the region threatened US interests, it was ready to defend itself.
It became quite clear that underneath that idealist veneer was a reality that the United States was going to act as an imperialist power.
That all began to happen under the 25th and the 26th US presidents. That was William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt. The Monroe Doctrine was starting now to evolve into something much more interventionist, as these two leaders started to plant stars and stripes across the region. In 1898, the US declared war on Spain, and they fought their forces in Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, and the Philippines. The aim was to remove foreign influence and replace it with American might. Back then, the rival was Spain. Today, in getting rid of Maduro in Venezuela, Donald Trump is targeting a different rival.
The most important economic partner for Latin America has become China. The United States can't overturn this by force of arms.
In 1904, Roosevelt's version of the Monroe Doctrine said that neighboring countries of the US should be stable, orderly, and prosperous. In Trump's version, the White House demands reasonably stable and well-governed neighbors. Roosevelt argued that if a country in the Western Hemisphere descended into chaos or wrongdoing, the US would step in and show force, which isn't a million miles away from Donald Trump arresting Nicolas Maduro, a man that he called an illegitimate dictator. And this more proactive interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, started by McKinley and then Roosevelt, also brought massive economic benefits.
Companies like United Fruit and Standard Fruit own massive plantations across Central America, and the US was willing to go in and install or support leaders that protected its interests.
It is ready by the beginning of the 20th century to intervene to secure its economic interests wherever it felt that it needed to.
Today, the economic interest is clear too. Trump told reporters that he'd spoken with the top oil executives even before he ordered the capture of Venezuela's leader.
We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, taking out a tremendous amount of wealth out of the ground.
Since Maduro's arrest, Trump has announced a plan to relax sanctions and a deal for America to buy 50 million barrels of oil from Venezuela. Monroe kept evolving through the 20th century, and so when we get to the Cold War, it's taken on a more political edge, including trying to get rid of socialist and communist leaders that the US saw as hostile.
The threat to Western security.
Like in 1954, when President Eisenhower backed a coup that toppled the government in Guatemala. Or in 1973, when President Nixon backed the removal of a socialist president in Chile and installed a brutal dictator friendly to the US. And then in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan invaded Grenada, and George H.W. Bush sent troops to capture Manuel Noriega in Panama, which we saw earlier. So that's the history, but what am I trying to say here? It's that those images of Nicolas Maduro in handcuffs, it may seem new and even shocking, but there's an older pattern at play here. And Donald Trump is definitely not the first US president to use the Monroe Doctrine to justify his actions in the Western Hemisphere. But that's not to say that this is just more of the same. Take the fact that this administration wants to limit migration to the United States as part of its foreign policy. That is unprecedented.
I think this is a dramatically new step. I mean, the United States had, for a very long period of time, been very keen to welcome as migrants educated elites with lots of human capital for its own economic interests.
But isn't the risk, though, that actions like this would just increase migration to America?
It's absolutely clear that wherever the United States has chosen to intervene, these regions have yielded refugees.
But maybe the most significant shift here is the rhetoric, the posturing.
Trump has essentially shorn all that idealism from the Monroe Doctrine and said it's really all about the United States taking whatever it wants in the hemisphere.
You know, really it's the language of colonialism.
There is no pretense here to talk about democracy or sovereignty at all.
None whatsoever.
The administration has removed one head of state already in the region, and they've made threats against leaders across the Western Hemisphere, from Colombia to Cuba, Panama and Mexico, and even a NATO territory, Greenland. If the US is seen to be acting without any restraint or consideration for anyone else, how will its enemies or even its allies react?
I do feel that we are entering a new era of spheres of influence, of great powers doing what they want, imposing their will on smaller countries.
Now, this is Donald Trump we're talking about, right? Which makes it practically impossible to tell whether any of these new threats are genuine or if he's just doing the thing that he loves the most.
I think that what the United States may be more aiming to do is to kind of squeeze these countries into an informal empire relationship, which is more easily controlled and more profitable to the United States than existing arrangements.
So Donald Trump cutting deals?
Cutting deals, squeezing and then cutting deals.
Ultimately, whether you think this Donald Trump Donroe Doctrine and this astonishing operation in Venezuela is just a continuation of centuries of US foreign policy, or it actually marks a radical shift, the real concern here is that this latest US intervention will go the way of so many other campaigns in Latin America in the past, where you get this cycle of tragedy, violence, and political upheaval. Under Maduro's rule, millions of Venezuelans have fled the country, and for many who stayed, repression and scarcity have been the daily lived experience. By taking out Maduro, the US has not stopped his government from running the country, and it's not clear yet how Donald Trump's actions will make life better for the people of Venezuela.
You could have a complete collapse of the Venezuelan economy. You could have millions of refugees.
What actually is likely in Venezuela is further chaos and further degeneration of the quality of life.
So let's talk about what Donald Trump might do next in Venezuela, but also the Western Hemisphere and what that might mean for the US, Latin America, and the rest of the world. To try and understand that, I'm talking to Ben Hodges. He's a retired US general and the former commander of the US Army in Europe. So Ben, thank you for joining me. I just want to start by asking, where does this go next for Venezuela? Not just in terms of what happens for its people, but also US involvement there.
Well, of course, I don't know for sure where it goes next. The administration is each day talking about how Venezuela is basically going to buy only U.S. products. The United States is going to take Venezuelan oil and sell it. And I mean, it really sounds like the vision is that Venezuela becomes basically a colony. The problem, of course, the challenge will always be, how do you actually run the country? We're talking about 30 million people that live there in a country that's not small. It's bordered by Colombia and Brazil, neither government of which is particularly friendly to the U.S. right now. More significantly, who's actually in charge on the ground? The regime did not change. Only Maduro and his wife were taken out, but everybody else is still there.
But if in the past, America in its involvement in Latin America has gone in, made regime change and put in their own dictator or leader, do you think this is a better way of them doing it, whatever you think about American involvement, that they've gotten rid of the guy they don't like, but they've not tried to put someone new in?
I think the part that's most frustrating is, you know, we've seen this movie before where the U.S. goes in, takes out the leadership of a terrible regime, but we haven't sorted out what comes next. Who's actually going to do it?
But, you know, in our video, we were looking at sort of the history of the US in Latin America since the Monroe Doctrine. And Donald Trump is following a pattern that we've seen over the centuries. But in many ways, he's saying the quiet parts out loud, that this is about American power, oil, whatever.
Well, you say that as if it's a virtue. The Trump administration is implementing their national security strategy, which they released back in November, which clearly identifies the Western Hemisphere as America's hemisphere. Under this administration's strategy is pretty much entitled to do whatever they want in the Western Hemisphere and to exclude adversaries like China and Russia, not only physically, but also to make sure that they cannot extract resources or control the Panama Canal, for example, things like that.
So that national security document, do you think that marks a significant shift in what we've seen in recent years or in recent centuries, or do you think it's a continuation?
Well, you know, the international rules-based order that you and I grew up in was created by the United States and Great Britain immediately after the Second World War to prevent exactly this. I mean, the extreme state behavior, which led to the First World War and the Second World War. And so it was recognized that, you know, we've got to change this. We've got to get some structures and systems in place where sovereignty is respected and protected by the big countries as well as the small ones. And so for the last 80 years, while it's never been perfect, and certainly there have been violations of international law and the international rules-based order by the U.S. and by many other countries, all in all, it worked pretty well. This does represent a departure.
But Donald Trump's been around for like 10 years. Don't we just have to come to terms with the fact that this is a new world order? And there's been a naivety, a reluctance for people to be like, yeah, okay, this is the new world order. We may be back in the early 20th century.
You're right in that candidate Trump, former President Trump, and now President Trump again has talked about, but this time, you know, he's got a team around him that he didn't have before that's willing to do his bidding on all of this. So yes, de facto, we're looking at a significantly different world order, but that doesn't mean that everybody should just roll over for it.
How do you feel looking ahead at where US foreign policy might go in the next 12 months?
I worry about damage to our relationships with all of our NATO allies. NATO has never been perfect, but it is the most successful alliance in the history of the world. There's a reason the Soviet Union never dared to attack NATO, and why Russia has never directly attacked in a kinetic way the alliance, because they did not want to face the combined capabilities and power of all of the alliance, which today is 32 different nations. The fact is, the intelligence sharing networks that we have with all of our allies is essential to American intelligence and therefore to our security. But that's based on trust. Same thing with the bases that we're allowed to have in UK and Spain, Italy, Turkey, Greece, Germany, Poland. That's for us. They're not there to guard Spaniards or Greeks. That's for us. And, we can't assume that that's going to be there forever. I worry in the coming year how much damage is done to these relationships, which are essential for our own security, but also our economic prosperity.
So just going back to the Monroe Doctrine and the Western Hemisphere, do you think Donald Trump's interpretation of that and what he's done recently, will that make America safer, Latin America safer, or even the world safer?
I think the president and his team believe that this makes America safer because we'd have basically unlimited natural resources and friendly neighbors to our north and south. In that administration or in that camp, you could point and say, look, we're definitely going to be safer. The problem is it assumes that the rest of the world goes along with it. I mean, Europe is the biggest trading partner for the United States. You can't replace Europe with Colombia and Ecuador and Chile on an economic basis. It remains to be seen, in my view, that economically this ends up being a good thing, even if it does end up lowering gas prices. I don't know that that's going to make us safer or better in a modern world that is much smaller than it was when President James Monroe issued his doctrine.
Ben Hodges, thank you for talking to me.
Thanks for the privilege.
Thank you for making it all the way to the end of this video, and make sure you watch our previous FourSight on Venezuela as well. Thank you to our history experts, that's Richard, Grace and Alan. Thank you also personally for reminding me of my Latin American history from my history degree, which was a very long time ago. Thank you also to Ben Hodges for talking to us. To all the history buffs out there, I know you probably think there was a comparison we missed or a detail we missed. Make sure you write in the comments below. Also, like and subscribe. We'll be back with another episode of the FourSight in a few weeks. What will it be on? I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know. Let's see what happens next.